Thank you, Dev. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Grace. And it's wonderful to see all the green out there. So happy St. Patrick's Day from a true Irishman. I'm one of those few true Irish Lutherans. There's not many of us out there, but so it's great to see all the green out there today. Jim is a very good friend of mine, one of these just really great guys. He's do anything for you, got a great family, he runs a really great business, honest business, well-respected in the community. Jim is just a great guy. Really love Jim. Good man. That was not always the case for Jim, however. You see, back in the day, many years ago, Jim was helplessly addicted to cocaine. And Jim will tell you that cocaine is one of the most addictive substances known to humankind. Well, one day a young woman came to me here at Grace, and she also was addicted to cocaine and needed help. And so I called Jim, and I said, Jim, would you talk to this young woman for me? And he was glad to do that. And that's where I first heard Jim's story. And he tells his story kind of like this. This is the way he likes to tell his story. He starts out by saying, I was really having fun on cocaine. Cocaine is a lot of fun. He says, I was having so much fun on cocaine. He said, I would take my weekly paycheck and I would spend it on my habit every week after week. But I was really having fun. He said, I lost my home. My home got repossessed because I wasn't making my payments on my home because I was buying cocaine. But I was really having fun on cocaine. And then he says, then my wife and my daughter left me. But I was having fun on cocaine. Man, I was really having a good time. He said he would take his weekly paycheck, and while he was driving to his dealer, he would try and talk himself out of it. But he would end up going anyway. And he would spend all the money he had, even the money he had for food, he would spend it on his habit, on cocaine. But he said, but I was having fun. I was really having fun. And finally one day, he sat down and he put a gun to his head because he felt that was the only way that he could get out of this helpless addiction to cocaine. And he said, it wasn't fun anymore. And then Jim remembered a promise. He remembered a promise he made to his father. Because you see, when Jim was growing up, he and his father and mother were actually quite close. And when his father was dying, Jim made a promise, a solemn promise to his father. He told his father that he would take care of his mother, so his father didn't have to worry about her. Jim will tell you it was that promise that saved his life. That promise. Jim put the gun down, and he got the help he needed to recover from his addiction to cocaine. But he will be the first one to tell you that that promise he made to his father was what saved his life. Well, today in our lesson for this second Sunday of Lent, we're going to talk about a promise. It concerns a promise that God made to Abraham. At the time the promise was made, Abraham was still known as Abram. The writer of Genesis begins our story like this. He says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. Do not be afraid. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great. So now we might rightfully ask, after what things, right? It starts after these things. Well, what is the author referring to immediately before Abram's vision? Well, in the preceding chapter, we see Abram in quite a heroic light. You may remember the story. His nephew Lot has been kidnapped by a plundering alliance of 4 kings who had defeated Sodom. But Abram raised a small army of his own, and he set out to rescue Lot. And he was successful. He rescued his nephew Lot. Afterwards, Abram met with Melchizedek, the great high priest, and gave him a tithe of all the goods that he had captured from the armies of the 4 kings. And he refused to take any of the goods himself, which he had plundered. In this chapter, we see Abram at his finest. It is then that God comes to him and speaks to him and says, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Now that's interesting, don't you think? That's kind of interesting. God is saying, don't be afraid to a man who has just had an incredible military victory over 4 hostile kings. Abram was victorious. Abram was on the top of the world. He was at the top of the world. But you see, despite that incredible victory, there is a lingering concern in Abram's heart. Despite the many victories that God had already given him, he still has some reluctance in his relationship to God and some doubts. You see, God had promised Abram that he would be the father of a great nation. Yet he and his wife Sarai remained childless. And being childless was seen as a sign of divine judgment in Old Testament theology. It's in Leviticus 20, 1 Samuel 1, and Jeremiah 22, if you care to look it up. Abram was concerned that a member of his household might have to one day be his heir. It was not uncommon at that time for a childless couple to adopt a servant as their heir. Abram saw that as his only viable option because he had no child of his own. You see, in his mind, God had forgotten his promise to him. God had forgotten the promise. After all, he and his wife Sarai were getting old, and there were some things that even God couldn't change. Well, you can't really blame Abram, can you, for this concern? So when God says to Abram, "I am your shield, your reward will be very great," Abram responds to God like this. He says, "O Lord God, what can you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir." So, in his infinite wisdom, Abram was trying to show God, as far as he could tell, that this is the only way things could possibly work. God didn't come through. So Abram says to God, "Look, here's where things stand. The only possible way out of this situation for us is for me to choose a slave as my heir." Have you ever done that? "Lord, I don't see any way that things can possibly work out. Here's what you need to do for me." And then, in our infinite wisdom, we explain to the infinite, almighty, and all-powerful God what he must do. We are so predictable, and our faith can be so pathetic. Then the word of the Lord came to Abram. "This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said, "Look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And then God said to Abram, "So shall your descendants be." Then the writer of Genesis adds these words, "Abram believed God, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness." With the victory that God had given Abram over the 4 kings as a backdrop, we see how really tenuous Abram's faith really was. Abram, the great symbol of faith in the Old Testament. Tenuous. No matter how many times that God had been with him in the past, Abram had difficulty trusting God in his present situation. And that's often true of you and me as well. The greatest need that you and I have is to learn to trust God more fully. That is the greatest need we have. We've been around this block before, but our greatest need is to trust God. No matter how difficult our circumstances are, God will never forget us and never forsake us. We need to trust God. There's a wonderful story that comes from the Superman movies. I know some of you grew up on Superman comics and the Superman television show. This picture here, this is the Superman I grew up with, right? Remember that? Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound, Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. And then it goes on, strange visitor from another planet who came with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, who could change the course of mighty rivers, bend steel in his bare hands, and who disguises Clark Kent, mild bandit reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle of truth, justice, and the American way. Right? Boy, some things you never forget when you're a kid, Okay, so Superman. So imagine this. This is the way it goes. Okay, so in this particular movie, Superman saves a man, from a burning building. He rescues him from the top floor, and he's carrying him to safety by flying through the skies. Kind of a familiar theme, right? So there they are, and the man looks at Superman, and the man looks down at the ground, and he says, "I'm scared, Superman. I'm scared. Look how far down that is." At this point, Superman gives him a great answer. It's the answer of faith. Superman says this, "Now, if I just delivered you from a burning fire, what makes you think I'm going to drop you now while I'm carrying you to safety?" Right? Well, that sounds very much like God's response to Abram. It also sounds very much like God's response to you and me when we're about to lose heart. Have you ever felt desperate about a situation? Felt like your back was against the wall? Couldn't sleep at night because of what was on your mind? Maybe it was a situation regarding your work. Maybe one of your children. Maybe your spouse. Maybe it was you yourself who needed an outright miracle because there seemed no humanly possible solution to your situation. You ever been in that place? Most of you have. Well, the next time that happens, I want you to think of the words of Superman and apply them to God. If I have delivered you from the burning fire, what makes you think I'm going to drop you now? All of us have found ourselves in difficult, troubling situations. And then, just at that moment, when we were inclined to give up, God has come through with some act of hope and promise. And for a while, we felt renewed. We felt a renewed sense of faith and joy. But as time goes by, we forget. We forget. And then we find ourselves in a difficult spot again. And we see no way out. And so once again, we doubt God's presence and God's love and God's promise. When will we learn? God can be counted on. God always keeps his promises. Now, there are times in our lives, for all of us, when faith is challenged by our life circumstances. Remember that the tests that we go through in life are not supposed to weaken us, but they're to help us grow stronger in our faith and life. God asks us to trust him. He tells us about the victory that will be ours if we just give him our cares and concerns. But God rarely gives us the full details of the process involved to get us to that victory. That's what tends to frustrate us. God doesn't give us the details. He doesn't tell us how he's going to do it. And then God's asked us to trust him. He just asks us to trust him. And as Superman said to the person he was carrying, "Now, if I delivered you from the burning fire, what makes you think I'm going to drop you now?" Abram's faith was fragile. It was fragile. But God's promises are rock solid. They are not fragile at all. We need to remember that. Like Abram, we don't always see how God is going to work things out. Abram was approaching old age. His wife was also reaching advanced age. They didn't see how it was possible that they would ever have an heir of their own, that they would ever have a child. But one day, God delivered on that promise. God always delivers on his promises. Pastor once told me about a good friend of his from another country who, along with his wife, was going through a deep, deep time of trouble. His wife was struggling with severe physical problems arising from asthma and bronchitis. If any of you have ever had difficulty breathing, you know how frightening that can be. Well, this couple struggled for years with her condition. They longed to go back to their own country, but her illness kept getting in the way. One day, the pastor reminded his friend, whose name was Mark, of the times Jesus stilled the storm on the Sea of Galilee. The pastor summed up for Mark the lesson from this story. "Remember, Mark," he said, "the boat will not sink, and the storm will not last forever." That is what having faith is all about, to remember those two things. The boat will not sink, and the storm will not last forever. Mark thanked the pastor, they prayed together, and Mark left. The pastor did not see him for a couple of months, and then they ran into each other. And he asked, "Well, how are things going? How is your wife?" Mark replied, "Not much better. She is still having terrible struggles. She can't breathe, can't take care of the children, can't take care of the house, and we have a really, really hard time. But I do remember the two things you said. The boat will not sink, and the storm will not last forever." So the pastor prayed with Mark again. Sometime later, the pastor received a note from Mark. Mark and his wife had finally gone back to their home country, and there they found an answer to his wife's difficulties. The asthma and bronchitis was now gone, and she was in glorious, radiant health, and they were rejoicing together. And at the bottom of the note, Mark had written, "The boat will not sink, the storm will not last forever." Later, Mark sent word to his pastor that his wife was in the hospital. The doctors suspected leukemia. Her asthma was under control, but a new storm had broken out in their lives. The pastor could only pray once again with Mark and his wife, and he asked them to cling once more to those important words: "The boat will not sink, and the storm will not last forever." So I hope you will remember those words, those helpful words as well. Earlier in Abram's life, God had promised him that he would be the father of a great nation. As the years passed, however, he had difficulty holding on to that promise. You and I can relate to Abram's difficulty. There comes those times in life when we have a difficult time holding on to God's promises as well. But God does not fail. We may not see how those are going to unfold, but God will never fail us. If I delivered you from the burning fire, what makes you think I'm going to drop you now? The boat will not sink, and the storm will not last forever. But there's one more statement of faith I'd like you to hold on to. When James Hewitt was a small boy growing up in Pennsylvania, his family would often visit his grandparents, who lived about 9 miles away. One night, while visiting his grandparents, a very heavy, thick fog sort of descended on the hilly countryside before they started home. And Hewitt remembers being terrified. He asked his parents if they shouldn't go a little bit slower than they were. His mother said gently, "Don't worry, your father knows the way." You see, Hewitt recalls that Dad had walked that road when there was no gasoline during the war. He had ridden that blacktop on his bicycle when he was dating their mother. And for years, he had made those weekly trips to visit his own parents. His father knew the way. James Hewitt writes, "How often, when I can't see the road of life and have felt that familiar panic rising in my heart, I have heard the echo of my mother's voice, 'Don't worry, your father knows the way.'" That's a good message for each of us. When life seems dark and we don't see any possible way forward, remember, our Heavenly Father knows the way. We can trust Him, and He will never let us down. There's one final thing to say. Don't forget that the purpose of all life's tests and struggles is not to defeat us, but to make us stronger. God wants each of us to grow strong in our mental, emotional, and spiritual lives. And so God has placed us in a world where tests do happen. They just happen. But the tests are not to defeat us, but to make us stronger. God established a covenant with Abram. He had him look up at the stars. And he said, "Look to the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And then he said to Abram, "So shall your descendants be." And God kept his promise to Abram, even though Abram could see no possible way that could happen. What promises has God made to you? Well, God has made several promises to all of us. The promise to be with us through all of life's journey. The promise never to forget us or forsake us. The promise to receive us into our heavenly home when we finish our journey on earth. You can take God at his word. He has established his covenant with you. Remember his covenant when you face challenges, when you come up against the hard times. Hold on to the promises of God. Don't lose faith. And if it helps, hold on to these 3 simple phrases. If I delivered you from the burning fire, what makes you think I'm going to drop you now? The boat will not sink, and the storm will not last forever. And don't worry, your Father knows the way. And remember God's words to Abram, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you are able to count them. So shall your descendants be." God always keeps his promises.
Thanks for watching. I hope this video can further the discussion of your relationship with Christ, either at home or maybe in the comments below.